welcome back to the Joe Walsh Show. We begin with good news. Trump pushing back today on race-based college admissions. Then, every single one of the top 10 murder cities in America have one thing in common, and I'll have it for you. And finally, guess what higher taxes are doing to the people of New Jersey? We'll have that later. But we begin with what I consider to be the pretty big news of a pretty slow news day. President Trump today, the Trump administration today, rescinding Obama administration guidance on race-based college admissions policies. To discuss this, really happy to be joined by Rob Shimshock. He is an education reporter with the Daily Caller. Rob, my friend, I thank you for taking some time this evening. Explain to everybody who's paying attention to us right now, what exactly happened with this? What does this mean?
Sure. So today, well, thanks so much, Joe, first of all. But yeah, so today we saw a tag team effort by the Justice Department and the Education Department. They came together to, as you said, rescind 7 guidelines from the Obama era on education. So what these guidelines essentially did was give schools a bit of a blessing from the federal government to use race as one criterion in a holistic college application process. So they essentially gave schools advice on how they should and shouldn't interpret affirmative action rulings made in cases like Fisher versus the University of Texas at Austin. And so what's really going to be interesting is how these repealed guidelines are going to manifest, coupled with the upcoming Supreme Court nomination, because, of course, one of the latest affirmative action cases was decided 4-3 in favor of the university. The deciding vote in that case was Justice Anthony Kennedy, who no longer is on the court now.
Well, and Rob, that's an interesting point. Give me your read. When I look at the court the last number of years, they've been whittling away at this affirmative action admissions policy, but it seems like they've still allowed it to stand, haven't they?
Sure. So it's definitely been challenged on a number of occasions. And I think right now, really, the key case to look to is Students for Fair Admissions, which is a group that's suing on behalf of Asian American students, versus Harvard University. And of course, the really groundbreaking thing that came out just a couple of weeks ago was the revelation that allegedly Harvard has been discriminating against Asian Americans by marking them down on their personalities. And so, I mean, if you were going to do such a thing, you, of course, can't change pretty rigid quantitative metrics like test scores, GPAs. But for them to actually be routinely marking down Asian American students' personalities, it might explain why, for a number of decades now, the percentage of Asian Americans comprising the student body has held at 17%. And of course, after they got sued, that number fluctuated a little bit. So there are definitely some very suspicious things going on this front.
Well, that's interesting, Rob, and I want you to drill down on that. I think a lot of people don't realize that that story coming out of Harvard a few weeks ago, discriminating are the victims. But at Harvard and a few other schools, we're seeing Asian American students being victimized by this race-based admission stuff.
Right. So I think that definitely if Students for Fair Admissions do prove triumphant in this court case, we will see that white students as well will benefit from it, because they do suffer not to the same degree as Asian Americans, because Asian Americans across the board typically would have higher average SAT scores, GPAs upon applying to college. So I think it really also would shift things in favor for white students as well. Now, what's really interesting is some of the response to this rescission of the guidelines today. And so, for instance, the president of the National Education Association said that affirmative action creates inclusive classrooms. And so if you've covered education like me for a little bit, or if you've just, been apprised of this information in the headlines, you'll notice these terms like inclusive excellence flying around. And inclusive excellence, I don't know about you, Joe, but it seems like a bit of an oxymoron to me, a bit of a contradiction in terms.
What does that mean?
Definition.
Rob, what the heck does that mean?
So let me tell you first a sane person's interpretation of this, which I think would be that excellence is by definition not inclusive. It is going to just, in order to be achieved, exclude some people who are less excellent. But inclusive excellence seems to be that we're going to include people among this higher echelon of academia. However, of course, what happens when you do include people based on their melanin or genitalia, just to establish some 50-50 quota, is that, the things that actually might matter, such as, actual aptitude in these subjects does tend to suffer. So unfortunately.
Hey, Rob, you're younger than I am. How this issue of diversity, the left has always worshipped diversity in our classrooms. Is this still a big idea on our college campuses today?
Yeah, you definitely see that. I think academics, really, the really shrewd ones nowadays, have been able to weaponize these terms like diversity and equality is another one, where they've come to mean very different things than what the average onlooker might perceive. So diversity, it does seem to mean all of the different superficial types of diversity and not diversity of thought, which is something that you think should matter in the classroom. Equality, similarly, is perceived or is legislated as equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. So that goes back to the quotas, where they try to establish these different quotas and not just make sure that everyone has no barriers to entry and treat all applicants as though, they're just coming with their scores, their activities, etc.
Hey, Rob, when you argue with or debate with your peers about all of this race-based stuff, this affirmative action, what's our strongest argument against it? Why is race-based admissions policy, why is it so harmful?
Well, I think this really ties into another statement that came out today, and this was from Kristen Clark. She's the president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and she was saying that we condemn the Department of Education's politically motivated attack on affirmative action. And so, yes, it is a politically motivated attack, Kristen. That's very wise of you to see that. What she forgets to mention, really, though, is that it's a politically motivated attack against racial discrimination. And it's sad that in 2018, there are still advocates of racial discrimination. Just this time, there are people who consider themselves progressive, whereas really it's something that is rather regressive. So I think really the strongest debate method is just to say, why are we trying to, argue to consider these characteristics, these qualities that are just skin deep?
Hey, Rob, switching topics, how Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, this first year and a half, almost 2 years, how would you grade her? How is she doing so far with education policy?
I give her a pretty sound grade. Lately, I've been investigating some of the for-profit colleges, and I am a little, I do treat it with a little bit of skepticism, as journalism should, in that she does seem to be pulling back on investigating some of these abuses from for-profit colleges who, in some cases, like Corinthian colleges, have defrauded students and cost them a pretty exorbitant amount of money that they've invested in education. So on that front, I would like to see a bit more transparency. But in all the other fronts, dealing with First Amendment issues, she's been very sound in speaking up for students' free speech rights. Jeff Sessions has also tag teamed on that front in terms of throwing the weight of the Justice Department behind certain students who are litigating for, greater free speech rights. Universities are clamping down on their rights to, pass out things on campus or some such thing. Another front on which DeVos has been very sound is on the sexual assault policies. It used to be the case in the past few years that you have a bit of a kangaroo court on campus in which, you hear the usual adage is innocent until proven guilty has been flipped on its head a bit to be guilty until proven innocent. And so DeVos has really helped accuse students on that front to make sure they get a fair crack of the whip in campus courts.
Hey, Rob, quick question for a quick answer. The practical impact of Trump rescinding Obama's guidance, what will it be?
Sure. So I think the practical impact will be that schools will be a little bit more hesitant to as firmly use these affirmative action policies. As I was saying before, these guidelines were in many cases a bit of a blessing on the federal government's behalf. And what really is going to matter are the Supreme Court decisions. What's really going to matter are the actual cases that set precedent to use affirmative action. Because while these guidelines do give schools some leeway in how to interpret those decisions, what really ultimately matters is those decisions themselves.
Hey, Rob, I appreciate it. Rob Shimshock, Daily Caller. Rob, thank you, my friend. I really do appreciate it. Hey, what do all 10 of the top murder cities in America have in common? I will have that for you next.